Thank you so much, Claire, and also to you and Jacob and your team. This whole weekend has been a revelation for me, my first experience of one of your events. It's left me full of admiration. I wish we could package up the whole thing, including the questions, and put it on in Sydney. Who knows, maybe one day, something to aspire to. As Claire suggested, I'm hoping this will be a glass half full kind of presentation, a sort of say not the struggle naught availeth. Though I should be careful with that poem, shouldn't I? Because it ends, westward look, the land is bright, which has a kind of Churchillian triumphalism sound to it, and I have to be careful about these things. But anyway, the Ramsay Centre has learned to be careful. The centre was founded only 7 years ago, actually, just before the pandemic. Seems a lot longer, with a significant funding endowment from a recently deceased Australian businessman, self-made, without a university education. He had made a fortune in healthcare, private healthcare. He was a generous and kind man, Paul Ramsay. He had a personal history of looking after young people in need, and he had an unusual idea. His conversations with young people had convinced him that many of them knew very little about the civilization that they were living in and to which he rightly thought we all owe so much. So our remit at the centre, when I was hired, this was what I was supposed to do, was to deepen community appreciation of Western civilization, principally by funding undergraduate degrees through scholarships for the students and salaries for the teachers. Now, we do also run a small lecture program, nothing like as grand and successful as this one. We also run, on a slightly more generous scale, a postgraduate overseas scholarship program, and we send 20 to 30 very bright young Australian graduates every year overseas on good scholarships to study at the top universities in the world in more or less any discipline, as long as it has some broadly Western Civ sort of dimension to it. Could be architecture or law, science or music or classics. I'm delighted to say that there's at least one of our wonderful Ramsay postgrad scholars here. Where is Gail? Great, thank you so much for coming. Great to see you. Grace, sorry. But given the time constraints, I can't talk about the postgrad program, so I'm going to focus on our undergraduate programs. And our challenge was to deepen appreciation for Western civilization in young people. Now, I still keep a kind of standard riff, like a burst, in my top drawer, particularly for high school students. It's not nearly sophisticated enough for this audience. However, it's a sort of Monty Python, Life of Brian. What has, apart from antibiotics, antiseptics, disinfectants, nearly all modern medicine, eradication or reduction of ancient endemic diseases and especially of perinatal mortality, rule of law and equality before the law, historically unprecedented equality between the sexes, representative democracy and separation of powers, 3, or is it now 4, industrial revolutions, electricity, gas and coal, and now wind and solar power technologies, the laws of thermodynamics, the theories of relativity and evolution, worldwide transport and communication systems, the internet, religious tolerance, separation of church and state, the abolition of slavery, liberal individualism, freedom of expression and assembly, open markets, all leading to vastly increased average prosperity, health and longevity across the whole world. What has Western civilization ever done for us? So it's always amusing to pile up these civilizational achievements, amusing and also accurate. But it does risk what I think Lord Frost referred to as the crusader mentality. It sounds more like an election manifesto. And it seemed to me right at the beginning when we first started out that our challenge was to take the Ramsay Centre's enterprise out of the binary culture war arena, not storm the barricades, as it were, but create a Trojan horse. It took the Greeks 10 years to figure out that that's what they needed to do. We had to defuse the politics and turn Paul Ramsay's vision into a purely educational reality, while at the same time bringing help to those, what shall I say, perennial Cinderellas of the university sector, namely the arts and humanities departments. And I won't only be talking about the humanities, but mostly. So STEM people, please forgive me. And this is a tricky project because those schools of gentle Cinderellas are also schools of anti-Western sharks. And helping them is a little bit like feeding the sharks by getting into the tank, you know. So it was clear to me from the start that it was pointless getting into the shark tank wearing a T-shirt that said, "The West is best," asking for trouble. So I had a different T-shirt that said, "I have lots of money." And universities being what they are now, unfortunately, which is gigantic corporations with an infinite appetite for cash because they have to feed huge bureaucracies. I don't know what it's like in this country, but in Australia we passed the point last year, I think, where more than half of everybody employed in universities was an administrator or a bureaucrat. Anyway, the money was always going to get me in the door of the Vice-Chancellor, but out into the campus, especially into the arts faculty, that was another story. So what was the story? Here were many people, good people, if a minority, then certainly a vocal and articulate one, and I'm not even sure it's a minority anymore, who were devoting their whole working lives to discovering and exposing all those bad, repressive, inhumane, unjust features of our civilization, indeed of any civilization, racism, imperialism, sexism, and so on. And those, of course, are all bad things across all their fields of study. And beyond that, their life's purpose, their very identity, was to see themselves as social justice activists, as well as, or even more than, as academics, as exemplary exponents of an expressive identity politics, and to teach their students to see the world the same way. And this is not new. This has been coming for a long time. I'm quoting now from the great sociologist Edward Shills at Chicago 30 years ago, looking back over the previous 30 years, so back to the 1960s. And Shills said, "We are now witnessing the acceptance of the notion that a person who regards his or her task as a university teacher to make propaganda for socialism or revolution among the students is entitled to the protection of academic freedom. Some teachers nowadays," said Shills, "think that the necessity and desirability of the destruction of existing society and its cultural traditions should be incorporated into the syllabuses which they prepare for their students. They think that as university teachers they have a unique opportunity, as well as a moral obligation, to further the cause of revolution. They think such activities should be carried on with all the guarantees afforded by the rule of a full academic freedom." That was 30 years ago. He was already saying that. It's got much worse. Let me add, though, that by denying the same freedom to those who disagree, that seems to be the extra level of academic freedom that they expect. The Ramsey Centre was not even allowed onto some campuses. We were publicly called triumphalist, racist, supremacist, reactionary, imperialist, fascist, Zionist, masculinist, neo-Nazis. It's all in public record in the newspapers. Students repeatedly said to me they felt threatened by my presence. I don't think I'm a very scary guy. Anyway, intolerant activism was one of our adversaries. But there was another, interesting, more interesting in some ways. So here's another even profounder thought from the philosopher Michael Oakeshott. In the 50s he was writing. "A university will have ceased to exist when its learning has degenerated into what is now called research, when its teaching has become mere instruction and occupies the whole of an undergraduate's time, when those who come to be taught come not in search of their intellectual fortune, but with a vitality so unroused or so exhausted that they wish only to be provided with a serviceable intellectual outfit." Lethal phrase. "When they come with no understanding of the manners of conversation, but desire only a qualification for earning a living or a certificate to let them in on the exploitation of the world." research grant funding is so structured and conceived that this is where all the prestige, all the promotions, all the incentives now lie in most universities. And in a perverse way, this often means that the teachers, who usually can't wait to get the term over so that they can get back to their research, see their task as essentially to tell their students about their research, so that they see whatever phenomena the discipline area is looking at always through that lens. It's very, very hard for an academic not to do that. And the roots of this mindset are historically very deep, as Anthony Kronman says in that excellent book that I've suggested you read. In the model of the university first developed in Germany in the early 19th century by Wilhelm von Humboldt, the brother of the naturalist Alexander. And his key insight was that universities should become places of specialist research, exploring the infinite range of natural and human phenomena in a scientific or taxonomic spirit. And that was very valuable and new. But it did mean that any attempt to offer unmediated primary texts from the past in all their richness and dynamism to be patiently attended to by teachers and students together was seen now as not only downgrading the value of the teacher's own work, in fact her or his own life as one that was dedicated to research, but as questioning the value of that very conception of research itself. The primary text had become a positive threat. It was almost as if the student couldn't be allowed to find something in it that the researcher hadn't already seen or couldn't endorse. And of course, students received these meta-messages loud and clear. The suspicion of the text, or even whole disciplines, as something that's trying unconsciously to hide something or to act as an agent of a power structure, all of that being something that needs exposing by research and in class. So in the modern era, undergraduate study programs, what we call majors in Australia, entire university disciplines indeed, tend to fragment into a series of research specialisms, which have themselves tended, over the last 50 years or so, by the nature of the research industry, to aggregate into new disciplines of a more thematic and activist kind: gender studies, race studies, cultural studies, empire studies, in effect replacing history, English, philosophy, and so on. So, the question for us was, how were we to counteract these two almost irresistible tendencies of modern humanities faculties? We knew about Columbia College in New York, recently in the news for quite different reasons. They still teach their core curriculum, although it's been very significantly watered down since we came into operation a few years ago, had already been watered down then from what it used to be. But there are also numerous liberal arts colleges, teaching-only colleges in the United States, and the oldest and most famous of these is St. John's College in Annapolis, in Maryland, founded in the late 1690s, which makes it the third oldest university in America and older than any in this country except Oxbridge and the ancient Scottish universities. The curriculum has been circulated already, and I don't have time to walk you through it, but this was essentially what my colleague Stephen McInerney and I turned to for a model to offer to our potential university partners. But we had one other big decision, another big fork in the road. Stephen teaches at Campion College, which is Australia's only liberal arts college on that St. John's kind of model. It's tiny, has about 100 students. My view was that while we probably had just enough money to create another Campion, another one of those, we would have trouble attracting enough students because, as Oakeshott saw, the overwhelming imperative is to get a degree that will lead to a job. And radical new arts degrees from unrecognised colleges don't look like they're going to do that. Much better to insert our idea into prestigious existing institutions, and if it takes off, others might want to get on the bandwagon. So that's what we did with 3 university partners, one of which has developed the second curriculum that I've circulated, not quite the same as the St. John's one, because each institution has to have its own take on the concept. For academic freedom reasons, the universities have to develop the curriculums themselves, but based, we hope, as closely as possible on the St. John's one. And the Queensland one that I've circulated has achieved the highest entry score for admission to the degree of any humanities major in all of Australia in just a few years. Very much in demand. And the other two partners are also doing very well. We now have upwards of 500 Ramsay scholars who've either completed their degrees or who are in the middle of doing them at the three institutions. Not quite at a national takeoff point yet, but there's no question this degree is now being perceived as a success, although of course there are many grudging, sniping remarks still from the hostile factions, especially always the teachers' unions. So the largest private donation into the humanities in Australian history has also now become a world-first teaching model, inserting an American great book style program into essentially an Anglo-Scottish degree, which is what Australia has. So, what exactly is the model? Why is it so good? What is it?
5 minutes, Simon, yeah.
Good Lord. You sure? Okay, so here's a key paradox. Many of these texts are both the constitutive texts of our civilization and its most profoundly original and countercultural texts, both the inheritors and the critics of a tradition. Machiavelli, Dostoevsky, Blake, Wollstonecraft, Galileo, Wittgenstein. In many cases, these are deeply contrarian texts offered to students not as the subjects of research-driven specialisms, but as resistant examples of free critical thinking themselves. I can never forget John Milton, the precious lifeblood of master spirits containing a potency of life as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. These are, if you like, the books on this curriculum are not just life analogues, but hyperlives, linguistic constructs that condense more experience into them than any other artifacts, permanent structures of thought that have outlived and even outgrown their creators. They are the polar opposite of the ephemera, the flickering images on the cave wall that Plato said we spend or waste most of our lives looking at, except now the cave wall is this. Close, prolonged engagement with that degree of real thought actually enlarges readers' own minds. And what's so important is that the capacity for attending to human complexity that they teach, the one that reading uniquely develops, is a moral capacity, the direct contrary of that lazy and dangerous tendency we now see everywhere to categorize all human beings by just one or two of their views or attributes. This is known as identity politics and is not a progressive force, but its opposite, completely regressive and in fact atavistic. We hope by taking these courses that our students will have been formed or permanently marked by something deeper and more human, more profound, more permanent, wiser and stronger and freer than the ephemeral chorus we all hear all around us now. And in the end, this is a connection with something more real, a spiritual connection, not just a moral one. And I'm finishing up now, Claire. It is as well a liberation. And I mean quite literally, this experience makes us free. It shows us further what freedom itself actually is, a kind of ultimate purpose in life, an end, a final goal, a telos, as the Greeks would say, the number 42, the whole point. The word scholar, school, from the classical Greek skole, means leisure or free time. Free time. What you do when you are free. And the original school, the School of Athens, the original prototype of our universities, was basically a philosophy discussion. That's what you do when you're free. The very word leisure is from a Latin term meaning license or permission, literally being freed up to do something. A scholarship quite literally makes you free to do what freedom is ultimately for, which on this account is to think about final values, higher truths. And in a Ramsay course, students do this in the company of master spirits, as Milton said, true goats, as they say nowadays, not just a random list of dead writers, but a dynamic and deeply connected 3,000-year-old conversation.